Welcome to the 3Haunted podcast, where we bring you all things horror, supernatural, folklore, mythology, and all things that go bump in the night.
What's up, everybody? This is your co host, Ashley Lunar Goddess, Gorilla Girl filmmaker and horror loving cinephile. I'm just your average podcast producing badass.
I'm John Thomas. Some would say that I go a little too far with my love of all things horror, paranormal, and meta, but I say, talk nerdy to me, and I'm all yours.
What's up, ghouls, gals, and all of our vampire loving pals out there? Today, we'll be flying back into the world of Dracula with international best selling author and great grandnephew of Bram Stoker, Dacre Stoker. Dacre is returning to 3Haunted tonight to discuss the upcoming documentary film called Father of Dracula, in which he has contributed years of research as well as serving as narrator for the film. Welcome back, Dacre.
Ashley, everybody else, thanks for having me. This is so much fun to be here and talk about my favorite subject, Bram Stoker. But this case is new because it's my first attempt at a documentary film. So thank you guys for having me.
So we were very excited. After we had you on last time, we were putting our heads together to figure out how soon can we get Dacre back on. So we had such a great time with you. So I'm so glad that you're here and we're able to discuss a new project that you're a part of. Now, I do want, because we are doing a live stream, I did want to show our listeners, viewers, the books that I have of yours. So
You've got the collection going there. Good for you.
I sure did. So I have the sequel. Oh, wait, where is it? Dracula, the Undead. Yeah. I have the prequel, Dracula. And then we also have the 125th anniversary annotated Dracula. So for those, if as you recall, those that had listened in last time, we had you on before I went to your amazing workshop, the 125 Years of Dracula. And so I was able to come to the Winchester Mystery Mansion and hear your amazing workshop about Bram.
Wasn't that fun? And I think around that time, Ashley, I was just finishing up that 125th annotated edition of Dracula. I've just got to give the viewers and listeners a plug here because that's kind of gone under the radar. But that book was co-written with Robert 18 Bassang, who died about 3 months after he finished it. It was really kind of sad. He had a fall in the hospital when he was in for cardiac surgery, and really strange. But if you guys remember in the novel how Renfield had a brain hemorrhage and had to have brain trephination surgery that Bram's brother explained to him how to do because he really did that stuff, Robert had the same thing. He was on blood thinners. He fell going to the John, banged his head. He had a bleed internally. They couldn't stop it. And he passed. And, in a way, his widow and I were chatting. Robert was a very interesting and complex guy. He would, if he was going to choose the way to go, he was such a devoted vampire and Dracula fan, that would have been the way to go. It's as did Renfield. But he and I found some really cool things. I'll just give you a teeny bit. Everything that was taken out of the typescript of Dracula, and the only way we knew this was that Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, bought the typescript and lets a few people look at it, dedicated scholars. Robert and I had looked at it independently about 2 years apart, and we kept all kinds of notes. We weren't allowed to take photos. So we were able to put into this copy of Dracula everything that was edited out because it was all literally crossed out. Back in those days, there was no cut and paste. We also deducted, based on that experience and looking at the Dracula notes, the missing 3 chapters of the novel. So that what you have in your hands there, Ashley, is something that is sort of the complete version of Dracula as Bram planned it. Now, we didn't rewrite the first 3 chapters, but we put it back in note form as Bram did. So that's what I've been up to. And those are the type of workshops that I give, is giving people all the cool inside secrets. And that's what I do when we're creating this documentary.
And it is such a captivating workshop. I mean, you come in with all of your notes and you really do take people along the journey of Bram from when he was born through his illness and beyond. And I feel like the workshop went by so quickly. I imagine it could be just a series of workshops versus one, but you did an amazing job of capturing Bram and putting together, or I should say, describing how your research came together, which I loved. And actually, you did mention this came out right around that time. So I had like Amazon shipped it so quickly. And I was able to actually get you to sign it at the event. So
there we go. Yeah. Yeah. It is like a puzzle. I think that's the term I use. And just to sort of, set the record straight, there are researchers around the world who have become very good friends of mine who make very interesting discoveries. One was the Lost Preface, one was the Icelandic edition, the notes, the journal that I found, all these different things. But I seem to be the one repository, being the family member, the great grandnephew, that takes all this stuff in, and I give people credit for what they supplied with me. But I'm able to draw conclusions because lots of circumstantial evidence together, to me, makes enough to make a compelling set of stories. I like to say I don't know for sure, but with 4 or 5 different sources, to me, this is what happened. And having also discovered Bram's journal in his great-grandson's attic, if you can believe it, in the Isle of Wight, they had a journal of Bram's for years, but the handwriting was so bad they didn't know what it was. And they invited me over when I was doing my research for the first book, the sequel to Dracula. And I found this thing, and it took 2.5 years to have the whole thing deciphered. Dr. Elizabeth Miller and I did it and figured out what was going on. And that helped me understand Bram. His wiring system was an 11-year journal while he was a college student. And then we went on to work with Henry Irving in London. Sadly, there was nothing in there about him writing Dracula. I think he might have stopped the journal, but as you guys probably know, he started keeping a notebook of all his Dracula notes, and that lives in Philadelphia in the Rosenbach Museum. So down goes the journal. He starts with this notebook, and that's where we see all the cool things and the things actually that we had chatted about. Why he started the story in Austria, not Transylvania. What made the change? Why the count was going to go to Dover, not Whitby, what made the change, all those kind of little subtle things. You've got to be able to look at those notes and cross-reference those to all the other little pieces of the puzzle.
what inspired you to even start going down this journey of piecing together Bram's life and his history?
I think it was really rooted in 25 years of teaching middle school and high school kids PE and science, and having a real fascination with how do you make people learn better? How do you teach them better? How do you get better performance out of them? I've actually coached all the way up to the Olympic level, and you got to get into people's head and figure them out. And I had that sort of desire to look behind the curtain to figure out people and get them on the right track or on a better track. And so my wife and I decided to start doing this with Bram's youngest brother, my great-grandfather, and we found a very interesting guy buried behind letters and newspaper articles and scrapbooks. And we decided, let's do that with Bram. And of course, the rabbit hole, Ashley, for Bram was, huge because it was, kind of highlighted by Dracula, but many other books. But also he was really famous for being the acting manager for Henry Irving, who was the most famous Shakespearean actor of the time, both in America and over in England. So there was lots of things written about him, newspaper articles, as well as the reviews of the novel Dracula and his other novels. But they didn't just talk about the story. It was like, here is this wonderful, mild-mannered Irishman. How could he have written such a sensational story that has scared everybody? And where did he get these ideas from? So that was the inspirations, getting to know your own roots and figuring out this guy that everybody else seems to be interested in, but I wanted to know the truth. I want to know the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Now, did your background in academia, did that help you kind of even begin to determine how to tackle, where to start, how to organize it?
I got to take my hat off to real scholars who I was lucky enough to work with and learn from, both Robert Bassang and Elizabeth Miller. And my son, who's actually a PhD candidate in English literature, is like, Dad, you can only put these things in. You have to have proof, resources. And so, Ashley, I straddle a little bit that world that I respect, and that is a world I sort of come from, but not at the university level and master's and PhD level. But I recognize that. But I also recognize that there's a heck of a lot more people who are more interested in sort of movies and stage plays and film clips and gossip and inside stories than they are academics who, just have to look at a certain angle. What is the motivation for this guy to write this thing? So I straddle both those worlds. That's my motivation, and that's why I've been to look at it. I'm not in one camp or the other. So I think I can therefore bring a compelling and interesting storyline when I do my lectures, as I approach this documentary film, when I help Chris McCauley and the Stokerverse make our RPG game and our card game and our board games. I'm not all super serious scholarly approach, although those things I am rooted in a bit, but I've deviated from that to make things a little more exciting.
And you definitely do keep it exciting, don't you? I mean, even in the talking points that you sent us, you drop little juicy tidbits that were like, ooh, tell us more about that.
Well, I figured we got to keep it interesting. I mean, I've had some cool adventures along the way. And, people tend to, once they get past what was it like growing up as a Stoker when you finally figured out that your great-granduncle was the guy that wrote Dracula. Okay, we go beyond that. What have you found out? Tell us some really juicy stuff. Have you had any weird experiences with people who want to take your blood? And the answer is to some of those things, yeah. So sure. I mean, there's all kinds of fun things we could talk about. The ball's in your court, Ashley. So fire away.
Hold on, people wanted to take your blood.
Yeah.
Is this on the vampire tours that you give?
Yes. I mean, are we going to make fun of people that like to take blood? I mean, it's voluntarily, though. Now, come on.
No. Not making fun, but I'm just, no. Has anyone actually approached you and asked for yours?
Yes. I'll keep a straight face for this because at the beginning I didn't. But it was, in a certain city that is well known for having vampire culture and people that like to practice, voluntary blood exchange. And I think this was at a big ball, and I won't say the name, but the Anne Rice Vampire Lestat had a name partly to it. And when the liquor is flowing and the the red wine is flowing, you loosen up a little bit. And someone said, "Geez, if you're ever willing, boy, I would really like to have some of the high octane Stoker blood. What would it take?" And I was feeling no pain myself, but I thought, wait a sec, how do I get out of this gracefully? Because I'm not really into that, but I also don't want to. I don't want to be disrespectful. So it's like, oh, geez, I don't think my wife would be too excited about that. I somehow, the way you sort of fumble away when you're stuck in a corner, so that got me, that one. But it gave me good memories, but I also had this idea of somebody walking around with a little vial,
yes,
of the Stoker stuff. Maybe I could market that the next time I go and make a Red Cross donation.
Now, do they ask you what your blood type is at all, or is that something that you make known to people? Because I know blood type is something that's tied to vampires.
It's high octane Stoker.
Well, we call it the V blood. Very good blood. V type.
V type.
Very good blood.
I like it.
Of course, very good stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I love that they complimented you in the process. They're like, we need that high octane Stoker blood. The flattery gets you almost everywhere, but it does not get you Dacre's blood.
Blood. But I was aware of all this stuff in my. In a different level, as an Olympic coach, I knew there was blood doping going on, steroids and all that stuff. But the blood doping was a really interesting thing. My guys never did it, but it's people who go to high altitude and really get your blood, really churned out, so you're sucking up as much oxygen as you can, and you take out some of the blood, and then you go off to your competition at regular level, and then the doctors put that high octane blood back in you. So it did make me think about, Olympic blood versus vampire blood. What would I like to have if I really needed it?
I mean, vampire blood apparently gives you strength and powers, and depending
Well,
what,
yeah.
mythology you believe in. So,
The recovery rate is really fast. I mean, just whenever you see these guys get cuts, boom, they almost come back instantly. So that would be great, the Olympics, but it all depends on what they're testing for. If they're not testing for vampire blood, we could get away.
Absolutely.
Maybe I gotta suggest that to the Romanian team when I go over there next.
you have Vlad the Impaler and Vlad the Olympian. So,
and
pole vaulting, right?
I was gonna say it got me thinking about like what events are we talking about here? Like what?
Of course,
what
there's got to be
events
sword
do
fighting.
vampires-
Yeah, vampire.
he stays away
fencing.
from javelin throwing. He's like, nope, we don't go there.
or archery.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, all that stuff is where it started. I mean, literally, I'm going off track, but the sport that I did and coached was the modern pentathlon, was sword fighting, pistol shooting, swimming, running, and riding horses. And that's the stuff that the medieval kind of courier did to be a successful warrior all the way up till the early 1900s. And then, of course, telecommunications took over and jeeps and so on. But that's what I did. So I can hold my own if I have to go at it with Romanian vampires.
Well, and I imagine that helped when you're writing the stories, right? Because you actually understand what goes into all of that.
Now we're touching on something. There are a few sword fighting scenes in some of my short stories and novels. And actually in college, I was asked to help choreograph a sword fighting scene on stage. And like, I was just a fencing guy. I wasn't a stage guy, but nobody else up at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York knew what to do. So I figured it out, certain basic moves for about a 2-minute sequence. And the funniest thing happened to me though, I was walking downtown with my girlfriend, and there on top of one of the frat houses, in the winter with lots of snow everywhere, was one of the two guys that I was coaching in this sword fighting scene, drunk out of his mind or high as a kite, something, with one of the stage props in his hand. And all the fraternity guys were down below going, stop. He's up there, like fighting ghosts or something. And the police had to come, the fire guys had to come. And I'm walking by going, oh God, that's my guy.
You're like, I didn't teach him that.
I had nothing to do with that whatsoever.
That's not proper saber technique. I don't know what he's doing.
That's right.
You shamed the Stoker's house.
That's
so
right.
Now, you've hinted at Bram's sexuality, and I'm curious, what can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, on the serious side, lots of people have drawn conclusions about Bram Stoker's sexuality. I say lots, a few biographers, because he wrote a letter to Walt Whitman, who back in those days was, he had been married, but he was gay. Nobody knew it too much until he started writing and started doing rather promiscuous poetry. And Bram, during his sort of years of coming out of his shell and becoming an athlete, was a big 6'2" physical guy, and was very into the science of phrenology and physiognomy, which is that whole idea of your facial characteristics show your personality and so on. And he wrote this letter sort of bearing all to Walt Whitman, saying your freedom, your sense of freedom is incredible, the way you express yourself. And two biographers in particular sort of reference that as, Bram must have been a closet homosexual because he's kind of palling up to Walt Whitman. And the way I read that, and after chatting with his great-grandsons who were raised by Bram's son, they said, there's nothing farther from the truth. Bram was a man's man. He was chasing after women all the time. But his whole take on Whitman was his confidence to write whatever the hell he wanted. And he was able to do so in America because it was a much freer society, both literally and socially. Remember, Bram was a Protestant, brought up in very conservative Catholic Ireland, moved to to England as an Irishman. That would have been very difficult. They're always under scrutiny. So I bring it up, and it will be discussed, actually, in the documentary, because it's an issue that people like to talk about. And they say, oh, and he was friends with Oscar Wilde as well. Well, he was a gentleman, and he was polite to Oscar Wilde. He was friends with William Wilde, Oscar's older brother. They were classmates. They were in the Philosophical Society together. And as a matter of fact, their mother, Lady Jane Wilde, was Bram's literary mentor. And she actually had a book that I found in Bram's personal library that gave him this sort of impetus to look into Transylvanian superstitions, because it had a section in it saying the Irish mythology of banshees and fairies and goblins, very similar to the vampires of Transylvania, and Madame Gerard has written a book about it. Bram also had a copy of the book by Madame Gerard. So I am sure that that's where the close connection to the Wilde family easily gets blown out of proportion, because people say Bram went to the prison that Oscar was held in because Florence, was a merciful person and wanted to, give the guy some money so he could buy something while he was in jail. And as a nice thing to do that a gentleman would do. It doesn't mean he was a homosexual. So those are the things we try to clear the record. Not that there's anything wrong with it, of course, but it's just I like to set the record straight and not sort of allow people to get away with a free pass on too much uncircumstantial evidence if they can't back it up with the truth. It's one thing to say it to sell a book. It's one thing to say it if you actually have the proof to actually develop this thing and say, yeah, maybe he was. Big deal.
Now, Bram, and you discuss this in your workshop, as a child, he had an illness, right? And how were you able to piece together what that illness was?
Well, again, that's calling upon experts. And I've spoken to a guy who is a medical doctor, and one of his interests is forensic medicine, historical medicine, looking into the Victorian era. And so here's what I do know. Bram was an ill child, most likely an invalid for the first 7 years of his life. He wrote one teeny little thing in a book that he wrote about Henry Irving, and it said, I used to be in my childhood, confined to my home, my room, didn't know what it was like to stand up. I had many fruitful thoughts in my mind and stories told to me that came into play later in my life. That's really about it. The rest is, hearsay. Was he bloodlet? Maybe. I did find information about one of his uncles. And they had a lot of doctors in the Stoker family, who was a famous fever doctor who did a lot of bloodletting. I found a treatise of explaining what they did to kids. I also found that the family itself had a long history, and it still does, of respiratory allergies and asthma. So I ran that up the flagpole with this doctor. And I said, okay, if a kid at 7 years old, they move 2 miles away from the harbor, which is mustewy and mildewy, and he grows up and starts doing walking for exercise, and then within 10 years becomes a champion all-around athlete, race walking, rugby, rowing, gymnastics, all these athletics, is it possible that he could have had allergies that he grew out of, or asthma that he grew out of? Because we know that they didn't have any medicine in those days to fix it. And so by putting those little pieces together, Ashley, that's the theory that the family has held. And I'm not the only one that believes it, but I've put all those things together thinking, how do you go from being an invalid and 10 years later being a champion athlete and not having residual problems with your cardiovascular system, muscular system, or anything like that? And of course, that's fodder for good writers. That's what J.D. Barker and I used in Dracula, as you know. It was, yep. How do you recover? Well, we turned that into, well, maybe there was some supernatural blood that is involved, and maybe the nanny's involved, and all that super strong vampire blood we talked about a few minutes ago, has something into play with making Bram Stoker a champion athlete. And then he's got to pay the piper, like as you always do. You can't get away with this. So that's how he actually runs into vampires and realizes that all this crap is real, and Bram Stoker needs to write a book about it to warn the world, and that's why he writes Dracula.
Which is fun. I mean, all of the different avenues that you could have gone with Bram and creating that prequel, you chose that route, and I thought that was fun. It reminds me a lot of the sequel tying in pieces, right? Of the real world, the things going on with the theater, and his fictional world that he created. I love that you married those two together really well.
Well, if you think of, I mean, I say think about it. My co-authors and I thought about that a lot. And the reason we did was because Bram did exactly the same thing in Dracula. He chose real places, real events, the landing of the Demeter, Whitby, all these different places in London that people actually knew about: Exeter, Purfleet, London Zoo. The addresses are all accurate, but sometimes off by one or two numbers only, just enough to give that feeling of reality, but somebody can't really check up on it because it's just off by a little bit. So he really set the stage for writing Dracula that way. So it was a no-brainer for me to say, okay, guys, I do the outlines. I'm going to find all these places. I get access to maps to make this story resonate as Bram did Dracula, as it's real. We've got to really stick to this playbook. And it was great. These guys loved it because the two guys I wrote with could really then concentrate on plot arcs, characterization, whereas Dacre sets out the framework and has all, I find the newspaper articles that they need to read that tie into our story, all those things, the type of guns you use, was there a tower here, was there a tower there, all that stuff is then created. And then I hand that to my guys and say, all right, this is what we think should happen. What do you think?
Now, you were on a quest to visit all the places that Bram went on holidays, right? Now, correct me if I'm wrong. It's been a while since that workshop at the Winchester Mansion, but in one of the libraries, didn't you find a book with his handwritten notes in it where he came up with the name of Dracula?
Yeah, you've got a good memory. So, the quest is ongoing because there's still things you find. I've been to Cruden Bay, Scotland, where he did spend many, like 11 or 12 summer holidays, where he wrote Dracula and other stories. Whitby, England, where he was inspired and where he wrote many of his notes. And I like nothing better than taking people with me on those trips to kind of experience that and see it and feel it and so on. But the library you're talking about is actually in London. And it was 2018, I believe, that Robert and I were working on the annotated Dracula. And we both got an email from Philip Spedding, that was the guy that ran the financial matters, the fundraising for the London Library. He knew both of us. He was a big Dracula fan. He knew that Robert had worked really hard on the notes for Dracula, deciphering them and publishing them. And he also knew that in the back of those notes, like a university student, Bram listed all of the resource books that he used for Dracula. Well, Philip thought, I'm just going to walk through my library. We know Bram was a member there, but because of bombing and fires in World War II, they didn't have their records. And the books that they had in a private library didn't have those little sleeves in the back. Remember those with the date stamps on them and the little card?
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have any of those. So what he did was he walked through the aisles of the London Library with his cart and a copy of his Dracula notes and started looking for every book that was listed in the back of Bram's notes. And by golly, he found 26 of the sort of 30. So he took them back to his room and he started looking through them, and he started going to chapters that he felt had something to do with, obviously, Dracula. He found books that were written by people who adventurers that went to Transylvania. He found the Baedeker Guide, train schedules in Europe. He found weather books, weather pattern books, all that stuff. And lo and behold, while he was looking at them, he found some of the corners of the pages turned down. He on pages where there was something that ended up in Bram's notes. he actually found pencil writing, strange little marks, not just simply like any of us would do, underlining something, or back in college we take out the old highlighter and just oof. But no, there was symbols and things. So it wasn't obvious that Bram did it, but it was pretty good chance that he did it. So he contacted us and said, any of you guys have any evidence or records of any books that Bram may have done that to? And I had in my possession at that time, it was like a 2-year loan from Bram's great-grandson's, my cousin, a copy of Dracula. Actually, it was came out in 1897. In 1901, the first abridged edition came out in paperback. So Bram's publisher in 1900 gave Bram a copy. Here's a galley book. Take out 30,000 words. And what he did with a pencil, because again, remember, you and I can do that with our computer and cut and paste.
Delete.
He started crossing out, making little notes. And when he crossed out like a whole passage, remember, he had to cut the book down by 30,000 words. So sometimes you take out a passage that's somewhat irrelevant at the description of something. You might have to bridge what you have left and where it starts again and put in some words and symbols. And guess what? They were almost identical to what Philip had sent us in pictures of the books in the London Library. And then he discovered a book that Bram's son had donated to the London Library 2 years after Bram died. And guess what? Same type of markings were in the margins and turned down corners on things that Bram had used in some of his other novels. So again, a lot of circumstantial evidence, but bingo, we narrowed this down to these are the books and these are the ideas, the thoughts of vampirism, of somnambulism, of trance walking, true ghosts, volcanoes, the devil, all this cool stuff. Now it's beyond a reasonable doubt, Your Honor. We've got the proof.
You've built a consistent pattern here, or you've identified one.
Well, that's it. And that's, as you know, in workshops, you're like, oh, yeah, that's cool. Let's see some of it. So I do these workshops as I did with you. I show them those pieces of paper. They're photocopies, obviously, but you can see that where they all link up. And you can see where he found the name Dracula. It was a Transylvanian warlord. How it got transferred from, Dracula, vampire into the name Dracula, so on. I mean, it was all kinds of shifts throughout 7 years, but it's fascinating to see the process.
That brings us to the segue of you're doing these 125 years of Dracula workshops and you're leading tours. And how did the father of Dracula come about? How did you team up with this filmmaking group?
One of my trips to Dublin, Ireland, I was invited to present at a film festival in Dunlowry, which is just outside of Dublin, and I met this fellow, Jason Figgis, who was a documentary filmmaker, a feature filmmaker as well, but a small-time guy doing his own thing in Dublin. And I thought, what a great spirit, what a cool guy, and I loved his film. And he has since, this was, like 10 years ago, he has since done bigger things, but he still loves to come back and do projects that he has complete control over from literally, he sometimes does the camera work, he does the directing, and he brings his friend in, John West, who does a lot of the writing and the publicity. And we just always thought about, and we just kept in contact. Hey, we got to do something about Bram Stoker one day. And maybe we'll get a pitch together and somebody will pay us a bunch of money and we'll go film in all these places that I just mentioned. And we had a couple of pitches and it just never came about. So we said, what the heck? Let's just do it. We're going to need a little money. That's why we've got this thing going at Indiegogo to pay for some editing. It costs time to go into big time studios with good software. But we've already got all the filming done in all these locations, because every time I'd go on one of these places, I had a really good friend from Romania, who's actually an Irish guy who used to be a videographer for Sky TV. He got tired of going to wars around the world, so now he's freelance. And he comes around with me and we film things in Whitby, in different castles in Transylvania, in Scotland. And we then send all this footage to Jason. We worked with John West on a script. and I provided lots of information. He wrote it out. And then I sat upstairs in my daughter's room, which is quiet with a good headphones and speaker, and did the narration just on my little computer, and then would send it over to Jason Figgis. And the magic when you do something, I mean, it's kind of a little bit like a Ken Burns style, where you might have some static images, you might have a few talking heads, you got maps, but it doesn't have to all be, filmed live video to make it awesome. It's the magic is in what Figgis does, is edit it great to give people 90 minutes of what an awesome story where the puzzle comes together. We know the man. We now know the man. What are his motivations? What was going on in his life? And, what went into writing this story that really changed the world, and getting input. It's nice to get other voices than just mine to give some sort of break, but also credibility. So we had Colin Hamilton and I went to conferences around different places and say, hey, I love what you have to do. Let's step into this room and have a little interview with you. And so that it's cobbled together, Ashley. But again, the genius is in what Jason and John can do to make it, make it all real and make it compelling.
I think one thing that I'm very interested in, I've worked on a couple documentaries myself, is the hard part is always like, what perspective are you coming from? Are you what are you trying to tell? Like, what is the story? Is it specifically about their life, like cookie cutter things? Are you trying to go at it from a family member's perspective? What are you trying to tell people? Are there things that maybe people that are misunderstood that you're trying to clear up for a lot of people? That's what I'm interested in. What kind of angle that you guys are going to go at? And maybe it's everything. I mean,
Well, BJ, that's a great question, because we have those discussions ourselves at the sort of the writing phase. But of course, that can change when Jason starts editing it, right? We have looked at, it makes sense to do this thing chronologically. But we're still discussing, do you start with Dracula and then it like goes backwards, like what happened? Or do you start with the troubled childhood of Bram Stoker and then it goes forward?
that was that was one of the questions. Yeah, and how not just the perspective, but the fact that you get to narrate the whole thing. That's I think what Ashley's point was, that they chose somebody who has that perspective, has the Stoker in them that can really tell a story. And I think that's what Ashley was saying that's going to make it successful.
First of all, the perspective really helped in the providing with John West of the information so he could work some magic with his script. And it's unique perspective, because I've gotten it from his journal, from actually talking to Bram Stoker's great grandsons who were raised by Bram's old son, their grandfather. So I get some inside scoop on what Bram was like as a father, what he was really like behind the scenes at the Lyceum Theater, what were some of the thoughts in his mind about the intense research that he did on all of his books. And it wasn't just Dracula that he did a lot of research on. So I wanted that to come out, BJ, as, he wasn't just a one-hit wonder. He was a guy that really was very diligent in everything he did, from managing a theater to changing the way the role of the theater in society. But he also put some special magic into Dracula. And that was this incredible research that resonated to people in England who were already interested in the occult, who were interested in mesmerism, in seance, in tarot card readings, in spiritualism. I mean, this was the time of Arthur Conan Doyle writing Sherlock Holmes, but he was still a big spiritualist, as was Bram and his buddy Mark Twain. So I wanted those things, behind the scene things, to come out in the telling of this story. And it really, I wanted it to be, who is the man behind all this, and what events in his life, as we chatted earlier in the show, the childhood illness, the hearing about bodies that were buried prematurely and crawled out of a grave. And so what were the events in his life, and how did those lead into his writing of Dracula. Even the train travel across America. He came here 8 times with the theater. I mean, 16 Atlantic crossings. That also means traveling all over the U.S. He had a map he kept on all the train routes, exact distances to get everybody to the right train station in time, and trucks were waiting for all 100 people from the Lyceum Theater, crews, and everything else. What did Bram do in the Dracula? He had all the train schedules figured out for the characters to go from London on the ferry to Paris, to Munich, to Vienna, to Klausenberg, and Bruce Streets of the carriage schedules. So I wanted people to see that it wasn't by chance. This man was living these things earlier in his life, and then it became his labor of love to bring it to reality while he wrote the horror story.
Where do you and the filmmaking team envision that this documentary is going to be released? Like, ideally, or just at this point in time, what is the plan for once it's complete? Where does it go?
Yeah, wonderful question. We're looking at sort of a 90-minute documentary film. So that, that itself puts it into the potential for film festivals. It puts it into perspective of maybe it can be sold to a History Channel. Maybe they want to chop it up and use more editing, and you make a couple of episodes with it so you can throw commercials in. Right now, the three of us are just thinking, get the thing done as well as we can, and let's plan a very cool release. I hope somewhere in Ireland or England. Ireland, where Bram was born and raised. The Bram Stoker Festival in October would be wonderful in Dublin. It would be very cool also maybe in Whitby, England. Something like that is, part of the iconic tapestry of the novel. And then, of course, hopefully it hits the road, because, when you think the novel Dracula was like published in like 30 languages around the world, probably at least half of those would want to, still interested enough to learn about the guy that wrote the book. I mean, everybody already knows about the creation, but let's give them a little inside scoop on the creator itself.
And people are definitely fascinated with the creation. Dracula has had so much influence on the vampire genre itself, on all of the attempts at spin-offs, right? If I call it a spin-off, we have the Bela Lugosi Dracula, we have Nosferatu, which is tisk tisk for taking the storyline. But it definitely, it has been the forefather of so much of the vampire genre. So I feel like anything, any little note or extra tidbit that people are able to get about Dracula, about Vlad, about Bram, they eat up. So this is great. I think that you guys are putting together a documentary on this topic.
And it is fed by the fascination in the world about the vampire, not just the vampire on film, because as you just said very well, he is depicted, she, they, them, depicted in many different ways, and have been since 1922 with the Nosferatu. And I will say, even though, and this is for the record, okay, Ashley, I did a lot of research with my son, the PhD candidate, to write an article in Scream magazine about the Stoker family perspective on the whole court case. And I learned an awful lot. What I wanted to know about was what was Florence's real position versus what were people really talking about. And it turned out that Florence Stoker was not the one that suggested that the film gets destroyed. That was the German courts when Piranha Film said, look, we lost, now you guys got to pay restitution, we're bankrupt. And they said, well, fine, you got to destroy the film. The film could not be destroyed because copies of it had already been sent around the world to different countries for previews. And the Independent Society of Authors, who were fronting Florence the money to do the court battle for 2.5 years, they said, we've had enough. We're not going to do any more court battles. It's over. And so thank goodness, even though Florence made her point and set precedent, legal precedent, this was the first novel to movie copyright court case that happened, and it was won in favor of the estate, the author's estate. So that was a good thing. But I'm also glad that copies lived on, because look where we are now with Nosferatu. How many different versions, right, have come out? In 1979, Werner Herzog did one, and we're just about to have another one coming up very soon, which I'm excited about, because I got nothing against Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee and Gary Oldman and Jack Palance and everybody else that played Dracula, but I like the gnarly old stuff, where the Draculas are ugly and they're, as Bram described, they're not the sexy, Rob Pattinson. Nothing against Twilight, but that's just not, Bram's thing, and it's not mine. It's great for vampires, but we do owe a lot to that. It keeps it going, but I think every now and then it's a good move to bring people back to the beginning and say, you might love all the blood and guts and the gore, but this is where it all started. And you might learn something that you didn't know about where it all came from a very interesting and complex man, troubled man. He did have conflict in his life and so on. So he wasn't just, kind of easy read.
Now, you mentioned that you've been filming as you visit these places and send it back. Do you find that it's easier to have access to these places and interviews with individuals at these places because you carry the Stoker name? Or do you just find that people are eager to talk about that because the legacy is so prominent?
Listen, there's no question, it's both. And the Stoker name opens up the door. And I say this seriously, it opens up the door. But you better, by golly, you better walk in that door with the game face on and your research done and a good series of questions, because people love to bring you down. If you are, as I am lucky enough to be born into this family with a big name, and I've had books out who become international bestsellers, but you're going to get people who are like going to jump on you and go, he's just trying to ride the coattails of his family name. My God, this better be good. Or I hated this, was nothing like the movie. What came first? But anyway, so I take it seriously that I'm a producer within the family and holding up the family's legacy, than a taker. And listen, I've met some good friends in the business. Lynn Lugosi Spears, she is a producer in the Lugosi estate. Lynn is the granddaughter of Bela Lugosi. Victoria Price, Vincent Price's daughter, a good friend. She's been on tours with me. She is a producer. She helps people relive the legacy of her father and get an inside scoop on somebody who's an actor who played in a lot of vampire films and a lot of horror films. She wants people to better understand her dad, just in the same way that Lynn Lugosi wants people to know Bela, and I'm sure Mrs. Karloff wants people to know that there's really a real person behind, all of the monsters. So to me, we take that seriously, and I also take it seriously that I realize that the book Dracula has meant an awful lot to an awful lot of people. And I meet people that say, I read that religiously, but every second year, and I get something out of it every time I read it. And by golly, Bram Stoker, what a genius. And people don't get it, but I do, and it means a lot to me. It's like, whoa, okay, I'm walking on hallowed ground here. What can I do for you? And I want to be able to tell them stuff that will then sort of help them, learn more to fulfill them from their quest, as this book means a lot to them. So yeah, I get a kick out of it, but I'm also careful when I walk in that door and present myself, because I want to make sure I do it right and hold up our end properly.
Now, the father of Dracula, as you said, you're raising funds to be able to complete the film. The Indiegogo campaign just recently launched, right?
Yeah, started April 1st, so it's recently out. And we need about $25,000 to get into proper studios to do all the remixing and the editing. And then I think Jason said it would take a couple of months to put the whole thing together. So I'm looking forward to it, because we've worked on it bits and pieces over about 3 or 4 years, a little bit here, a little bit there, and it's like slowly coming together. So I can't wait. But I urge people that the rewards are cool, but also anything you could do to help get our story out there is much appreciated.
Could I ask you what the most challenging part of making the documentary has been so far, besides obviously funding it currently?
Oh, yeah. Um, I think the hard part is figuring out when I'm leading a tour and I maybe take a day or two afterwards to say, okay, Colin, I'm in Romania, or I'm coming to Whitby, or going to Scotland. Let's spend a couple of days filming because I'm already here. I've got the plane ticket paid for by the tour. I can't do much filming when I'm working and being there for everybody. But I had a heck of an experience with my son and bad weather. That was the toughest part, getting to the top of an extinct volcano in northeastern Transylvania to find the actual location of Bram Stoker's fictional castle based on the coordinates they left in his notebook. And we had one day to do it, and the weather was terrible. We went anyway. And if any of you guys have ever been at high altitude, when there's thunder and lightning in the area, you realize, you probably shouldn't be there. But
It's terrifying.
We needed to be there. Yeah, we needed to be there. And, GPS wasn't working, cell phones weren't working. We found the spot, we kind of planted the flag. So really, BJ, it's getting the right footage. I'm not a filmmaker, but I have a pretty good eye now for what I want to depict, how I'd like to tell the story to people. So it's like, hey, Colin, you got to be here. We got to take this shot. We got to do this castle from here. He'll figure out the angles and the lighting and everything else. But it's how to turn my thoughts and ideas about how to tell the story about what Bram Stoker found in a book that somebody else wrote, so that we can show, here's a book from the London Library, and this is what the volcano is like that he found, or this is the trail in the Borgo Pass that he found. It was in this book, and here it really is. Getting that together and then delivering it to John to write it in the script, and then to Jason which he hasn't done yet, to edit the whole thing together. It's that puzzle thing, BJ.
Oh yeah.
Now, on this journey of piecing together Bram's life and writing the sequel and the prequel to Dracula, is there anything that you've learned about yourself in the process?
I need to drink more fluid when I'm really hot in Romania, because I got a kidney stone a few years ago, which I've never had before, and I'm told because you let your idiot self get dehydrated and probably drank too much iced tea or whatever it is. You know, like, you can't find a toilet everywhere, so I just don't drink so much all the time, right? But I suffered the price, and that's another story for another time. It's not in the documentary, but going into the hospital in Targovishta and having to lie there on a gurney next to all these ladies having the ultrasound done with their babies, in their bulging stomach, and I'm sitting next to them half naked with something over me, using the same freaking ultrasound machine with just a little bit extra jelly on my lower parts to find out if there's a bloody stone in there or not.
Oh, no.
That was what I learned. Drink the damn water, Dacre. Don't put yourself through that again.
So take care of yourself.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, it's not easy. People think, oh, it's glamorous, but it's not easy. You go to strange places, and I begin to understand the language. I can't speak it, but it is listen. Probably the best word of advice on a serious note is learn to be a good listener, to understand people, watch the body language, figuring out what they're saying. On one of my trips over there, I was paid to go over by the Romanian government to talk about the tourism business and how they can do a better job kind of capturing and capitalizing in a good way, a positive way, on the whole idea of vampire tourism. And I listened as well as I could, but they never told me until 15 minutes before this conference and the news meeting were there, I was not going to have my laptop or a power stick to stick in. I was going to have to do this all in the seat of my pants. And so I was sitting in, with the other speakers with the simultaneous translation going on, talking to one guy next to me who was Charlie Oddie, who's a brilliant filmmaker, does Wild Carpathia. He says, I said, well, Charlie, where's your memory stick? Where are you sticking this in for your talk? He says, there's none of that, Dacre. Didn't they tell you? I said, no, they never told me anything. So I had to get up in front of a couple of hundred people in all news media and just really winged it. But as you can tell, I can blab with the best of them, so that wasn't so hard. But yeah, that's be prepared, listen well, know your stuff, and be polite.
I do have one question in regards to that. Like you've done a lot of traveling, you met a lot of people, and you've done things through social media. Um, how do you think Bram would navigate the world today if he had to release his book in a world of today with social media and all of the things? How do you think he would, what do you think he would do?
Well, I'll tell you something, BJ. Bram was ahead of his time when it came to technology. Uh, he was a guy that knew also how to work the press for Henry Irving. He was very popular with the press, but he knew when to turn them on, turn them off. He had a typewriter, which was ahead of his time. He utilized things in the novel Dracula, like a camera, like a searchlight. Um, all these things were very, very advanced for their time. So I think he would be somebody, because he knows the theater, he knows how to do publicity. I think he would be one of those guys, uh, figuring out how to get influencers on TikTok and Instagram. He would figure all that stuff out. He would have more than one iPhone, probably like Ashley does, and all kinds of different. Well, I think Ashley, you're probably pretty conversant in all social media and probably have many devices. I think Bram would have had all that too, because he was up on that stuff. Interesting guy, and I do want to make sure that before we close out, at some point, I want to ask you guys a question here, because I've been the one getting grilled on this, which I like. I've enjoyed it, but you guys have got to know Bram an awful lot. I know even before our chat this time and even last one, and you also got a filmmaking background. And one of the things that I am seriously pondering, but it's not my job, but I get to give input to Jason, is as much as you guys know about Bram Stoker now, you know he died in 1912. The book had been out a little bit. It wasn't super popular. Dracula was not on stage yet. Lugosi was long away. He didn't get going until 1924 on stage, and then 31 the film. You got a documentary that we've been talking about, and BJ's been asking great questions. But what do you think is a good way to wind it down or to leave a message at the end? You got a guy that dies after a long and interesting life, somewhat tragically. He doesn't get to know what his biggest success in life, what it really was, and how it impacted the world, and how it went on to be both horrifying and interesting to the world. So, as filmmakers, you in your world, give some advice to us and maybe your listeners as well. How do you think this thing should wind down, this documentary film? Because I know Jason's going to be listening, and he always takes little bits and pieces from what fans like to say. But I'm going to throw it back at you guys for a moment.
I have something.
Go ahead.
Do tell.
So you were talking about how he wrote a letter. Was it to Walt Whitman? No, who
Yeah.
did he?
Yes.
Yes. And how he was inspired by Walt being true to himself and writing how he wanted to write about what he wanted to write about. So maybe ending it with that letter to Walt while you have, video overplay of what became of his legacy, of Bram Stoker's Dracula in film, of 125 years of Dracula, like to show that because he was true to himself and all the work he put in, although maybe he didn't see the success at that point in time, he was true to himself. What he looked, up to in Walt, because he also lived that within himself, his legacy did continue, and it created, it became that impact. It created a whole darn genre and continues to carry that genre. So maybe something like that.
So before we go any farther with BJ, if Jason uses that, do we have to pay you anything, Ashley?
No, I give it freely.
Okay. Just want to make sure, because Jason's probably going to whack me upside the head if you say,
Hey, you never know. I might go Indiegogo be a producer, in which case.
There you go. Then you could get it. We might need you. So
then I get a credit.
There you go. BJ, what are your thoughts on how this, the right way or an interesting way to end the film?
So for me, the biggest thing about Bram's life, because we live in a world where it's easy to travel, it's easy to, you just get on your phone, Google Translate, you can talk to all these different people, and it's easy. But back then, like, there's all these diseases going on. Travel is not the easiest thing to do. There's all these different things that he had to go through. It took longer to do all of these things, and he was successful in his life. Like, I think as a successful human being, people need to be able to travel and experience the world, experience diversity, experience, as much as they can get out of life. And I think that's the successful thing. That's even, I mean, obviously Dracula and everything has become an iconic figure and everything, but the way he lived his life, I think, is maybe the more successful thing for him, for his everything. Because as a traveler and a filmmaker, think about what would I do in those situations. I'd be like, no man, I'm tired. Like, I don't want to travel to all these different countries. It's just the passion that he lived with, the people that he met, the conversations he had. It was rich and full. And I think most people in this world don't get that. They don't get to experience what he got to experience. And I think that led to him writing such a iconic, piece of work there. And so maybe that would be
That
something that I would.
That's an interesting point, because we may have talked about it in our last show, but one of the things he learned coming to America, as you say, BJ, traveling and train traveling across the whole country, he met Buffalo Bill Cody and became very good friends with Buffalo Bill Cody and helped Buffalo Bill come to the UK and perform in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, in London. Stoker and Irving were showmen of the time, and they brought equally a big time American showman to come over. What Bram Stoker did with that, so this is what enriched his life, BJ, was not just the traveling and the relationships, but it was actually utilizing some of that inside information. He used Buffalo Bill as the model for Quincy Morris, the gun-toting, free, slang-speaking American. He used Buffalo Bill Cody as the model for Elias Hutchison in the short story The Squaw that I turned into a graphic novel with Chris McCauley called The Virgin's Embrace. So he did this with people that he met, took different elements of places, of people and things from all of his travels. And I think you're absolutely right. The richness that he had from these travels and the relationships that he had, that's something to celebrate in this film, and somehow sort of highlight that, not what he lost by not seeing the success of Dracula, but what he accomplished with his relationships and his travels and the worldliness that he attained.
I think that's fantastic. Well, I'm excited to see where this goes and what thread becomes that golden thread that ties the documentary together. I'm excited to see what you and the filmmakers put together. And for those that are listening and those that are watching, please go to Indiegogo and contribute in any way that you can, even if it's just sharing the campaign. That also helps. If you go to Indiegogo.com, you'll be able to search Father of Dracula and their campaign comes up, and share it, like it, contribute if you can. Anything helps. But this has been an amazing conversation. I have words. Dacre, do you have any final thoughts for us before we wrap this amazing evening up?
No, I mean, I just, as you guys know, enjoy talking to people like you guys who are interested, who help give a platform for other people who are interested in the arts, in the writing, in filmmaking, and so on. So I just say thank you, and keep the candle burning, light for other people like me that you give this opportunity to, because I think it's wonderful. It makes life more interesting to get behind the curtain. and see what's really going on. So thank you for helping me draw back that curtain of my famous relative, and we'll see where we go. Hopefully, we'll be successful with our campaign, and Father Dracula will be a huge success.
Well, thank you for being behind the curtain and willing to come on and talk about this stuff with us because it's it's such like I said before at the beginning, you can have so many episodes. You could probably have an entire podcast, and I mean like series on Bram Stoker, on Dracula, on the impact of the vampire genre, and on yourself. You're an amazing storyteller yourself. So we appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. And I'd love to come back anytime you'll have me. All right.
Anytime, every time. All right. So, John Thomas, do you want to bring us home?
I do. Thank you again, Dacre, for coming on. We appreciate it. It's been too long, for sure. And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers for watching and listening to this episode of 3Haunted Podcast with your host. I'm John Thomas.
I'm Ashley Lunar Goddess.
And I'm BJ Segura.
If you have any questions, comments, or episode suggestions, please feel free to email us at 3hauntedpodcast@gmail.com. And if you haven't done so already, please like, follow, and subscribe to all of our social media. You don't want to miss amazing guests like Mr. Dacre Stoker here.
Until next time.